The Self-Care Learning and Discovery Series is back, and it's bigger and bolder than ever. This is the premier self-care event of the year, bringing together self-care enthusiasts of all backgrounds and disciplines from around the world. The World Health Organization defines self-care as the ability of individuals, families, and communities to promote health, prevent disease, maintain health, and to cope with illness and disability with or without the support of a healthcare provider. We also know that self-care means different things to different people. What does self-care mean to you? You'll have ample opportunity to reflect on this question during the Discovery Series, with more than 20 interactive virtual sessions organized by self-care experts worldwide. The Discovery Series will elevate cutting-edge research, programming, and advocacy insights across a wide variety of self-care topics, and we encourage you to attend as many sessions as possible, especially on topics that may be new to you. The Self-Care Learning and Discovery Series, a core activity of the Self-Care Trailblazer Group, is organized by the White Ribbon Alliance in partnership with co-sponsor organizations and esteemed steering committee members. We also want to thank all our session organizers and presenters who have voluntarily dedicated their time to curate this event with us. We are pleased to share that every session will offer live, simultaneous interpretation in French, Spanish, and English. To access the interpretation, simply navigate to your meeting controls located at the bottom of your screen. Click on the globe icon labeled Interpretation and select the language you'd like to hear. Joining from your phone, tap on the ellipses to find the interpretation feature and then select your language. Please note, you can switch languages at any time throughout the presentation. The session is now about to begin. Don't forget, whether you're working to influence policies or programs, advance universal health coverage, or improve your own self-care, we hope that you will take the learnings from today's discussion and apply it to your own work. To that end, we invite you to continue the conversation and take action with us by becoming a member of the Self-Care Trailblazer Group. So get curious, jump in, and share your ideas and insights with us. We look forward to advancing self-care together.
Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to have you joining us today for our session, which is the missing ingredient in self-care behavior change, a case study on adaptive behavioral programming. And we're really excited to have you all joining with us today. And we would love if, to get us started today, you could introduce yourselves in the chat. Feel free to write your name and let us know where you're joining from, and we'll get it started from there. Next slide. My name is Heather Hancock, and I'm joining from the Johns Hopkins University Center for Communication Programs. And I am joined by many wonderful colleagues here who I will briefly introduce. My colleague Allison Pack, who is also from Johns Hopkins University Center for Communication Programs. Abby Winskill from, excuse me, Population Services International and the DISC project. And Andrea Ferrand from Population Services International as well. And we will all be co-facilitating and moderating this session. Next slide. Our objectives for this session today are to reinforce the importance of behavior change across users, providers, and influencers in unlocking the potential of self-care interventions. We also hope that there will be learning by introducing the supporting sexual and reproductive self-care through social and behavior change framework and bringing that to life through a case study that we will present. And then also some knowledge exchange. We're really hoping that we will have the opportunity to share experiences and learnings to build our collective knowledge on designing effective behavior change programs for self-care. And we really do hope that this will be an interactive and engaging session, and that really depends on all of you and your interactions. So we hope that you will share with us your experiences and your thoughts so that we can all learn together. Next slide. So our agenda today is we've started out with some introductions and the overview of the session. And now we're going to go into a little bit about social and behavior change and self-care. And we're going to hear about the SBC self-care framework. And then we will hear a case study from the DISC project. And then we will have a group discussion. So again, we really hope that you will engage in that discussion so that we can all learn from everybody's experiences. Next slide. So we want to do a quick poll here today to start us off. And we're curious to hear about a challenge that you have faced in your self-care efforts, any sort of challenge that you've faced. And so we are going to use Mentimeter for this. If you've not used Mentimeter before, you can navigate to the website here, mentimeter.com, and you can use the code that's placed here, 29916976, so that you can answer this first question. And we will be using the Mentimeter poll quite a bit throughout the session, so you can stay on that site once you've had a chance to answer this first question, because we will come back to this. And we'll navigate here so that we can start to see responses. So take a minute to think about a challenge that you've faced in your self-care efforts. Okay, great. Starting to see some responses coming in here. That people sometimes tend to misinterpret the concept of self-care. Many people don't know what we mean when we say self-care. So same sort of idea, that there's this misunderstanding of what self-care is, thinking that it's just getting a massage or resting, which can be a part of self-care, but not typically what we're talking about in our programs. No awareness. Okay. Oh, okay. So I think one of my colleagues will drop a link into the Mentimeter. So you go to menti.com and then you will type in the code that is 29916976. So you can join that on your computer or on your phone. Okay, I'm seeing a couple other things coming up here, that there's slow action by policymakers. So that's a real challenge there. There are other priorities other than self-care. There's some hesitation or lack of trust that people can self-administer, self-inject, or self-test effectively. That could be, I suppose, on the side of providers, but also the self-carers themselves. Trying to reach a very large population segment. It's hard to make your work known around self-care. Okay, excellent. We'll wrap up in just a few more seconds. So if anybody else wants to put another challenge in the Mentimeter, please go ahead. Okay, well, let's go ahead and go back to the slides. Those are some interesting challenges, and we're going to talk a little bit about how taking a behavioral approach and using social and behavior change techniques can help to address some of the challenges that you may be facing in your own self-care efforts and programs. So to start us off, I want to talk a little bit about what social and behavior change is. And social and behavior change is an evidence-driven approach to improve and sustain changes in individual behaviors, social norms, and the larger enabling environment. And so taking these behavioral approaches really will help to see the kind of behavior change that we want to see, that are necessary with self-care programs, can also address the larger social norms that drive those kinds of behaviors, and the environment, which also may enable or inhibit some of the behaviors that we want to see with self-care practice. Next slide. In short, we know and have seen from evidence that social and behavior change, or taking that behavioral approach to our self-care efforts, can contribute to more successful self-care programs. And I'm going to go through a top 10 list of how SBC specifically can help contribute to that success in your self-care efforts. Next slide. So our number one reason here is, excuse me, that SBC can enhance your existing efforts. So it enhances existing service delivery and policy efforts because it is a cross-cutting technique or set of approaches that you can use to really complement and enhance what you are already doing. Our second reason is that SBC supports habit formation and maintenance of those habits, both individually and environmentally. SBC draws on the field of psychology to really understand what is it that helps to create a habit and to keep doing a habit over time. It sheds light on how those habits are formed, what motivates people to adopt new behaviors and form those habits. And it also uses environmental or contextual clues to shape and prompt habit formation and maintenance. And we've seen that it can also address some of those social determinants of health, like access to products or services, or education levels, that are things that would, in the end, influence habit formation or individual behavior. The third contribution that SBC can make is that it really deepens the understanding of potential self-carers, and it provides insights on how we can tailor our efforts, our self-care efforts, according to that understanding. SBC helps practitioners understand the self-care needs, their preferences, what influences whether they start or continue self-care, and it can help practitioners understand what drives self-care behavior and product use by using different techniques like audience analysis or segmentation, human-centered design approaches. And in particular, SBC uses things like power analysis and social network analysis to provide insight on power dynamics and relationships, which we have found to be very critical, since lots of different people and groups influence an individual's decision and ability to self-care. And SBC program design explicitly takes into account these needs and preferences and power dynamics, all of these understandings, to then design programs that respond to those particular needs or realities or drivers of behavior. Number 4 is that SBC cultivates community support for self-care, and it can address the cultural and normative influences on self-care behavior. Community culture and organization and norms, they affect behavior, and we know that from experience. And SBC uses defined, systematic, and community-led approaches to identify and advance local priorities that practitioners can apply to self-care interventions. So things like advocacy with religious and traditional leaders, or community engagement and group dialogues, exploratory games, normative approaches, and accountability systems. Number 5 contribution is that SBC can build individual self-efficacy to practice self-care. We know that self-efficacy, or the feeling that you can engage in or practice a particular behavior, impacts whether someone will try a new self-care behavior or sticks with it. And SBC has a long history of bolstering self-efficacy on a variety of topics, from condom use to couples communication. Next slide. The 6th contribution I want to cover is that SBC fosters provider behavior change related to self-care. We've learned that oftentimes providers can be a barrier or a facilitator to self-care uptake. And SBC helps practitioners understand providers as an audience and explore the drivers of their own acceptance or promotion of self-care for clients. It uses various techniques to engage providers in creating solutions for self-care and excuse me, and provides a value proposition for providers. It helps to address some of those threats to their livelihood. Number 7 is that SBC provides quality, reliable information about self-care drugs, devices, and diagnostics. Self-care users must have the ability and agency to obtain, parse, and use accurate health information. In other words, that they're health literate and can distinguish between high-quality products and inferior alternatives. SBC can get tailored information into clients' hands self-care's hands and in their preferred delivery method and help them to recognize what quality is. Number 8 is that SBC facilitates linkages to the health system, whether that's because people are experiencing side effects or have questions or have particular needs. SBC can offer that sort of support or guidance and referrals back to services through apps or product packaging or promotional materials, hotlines, feedback mechanisms, etc. Number 9 is that SBC supports self-care advocacy efforts, whether that's advocacy for newer revised policies or increased funding for self-care. SBC can be used through the evidence-based techniques for advocacy. And then finally, number 10, SBC can inform new self-care behaviors, such as when entirely new behaviors are needed to be practiced by clients, such as swabbing a nose for a COVID test, or when HIV self-tests were new, knowing how to do those sorts of behaviors, SBC can inform those. And so I'm going to pass it over, next slide, to Allison Pack. Oh, excuse me, sorry, we're going to do a quick poll again. And we just want to hear really quickly if you have used an SBC or a behavioral approach in your self-care efforts. So yes, no, or you're not sure. So again, you can go to Menti. The link is in the chat. Okay, it looks like we're seeing that there are quite a few people who have used some sort of behavioral approach in their self-care work. Some people are not sure, and there's one no. So that's good to know, and we can address a little bit about, probably help you to understand a little better what SBC is and whether you've used those approaches. So I will now turn it over to Allison Pack, who will walk us through the SBC self-care framework, which was created as part of the SCTG efforts for understanding what SBC is within self-care. Over to you, Allison.
Thanks, Heather. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So like Heather said, I'm going to introduce you all to the SBC self-care conceptual framework. This framework is also available in French, and we'll be sharing a link to it later on in the chat. But in general, this framework articulates how SBC can support sexual and reproductive self-care initiatives and contribute to improved health outcomes. And it does this by helping users of the framework understand what drives self-care behavior and make policy and programmatic decisions that use SBC to enable those SRH self-care behaviors. Next slide. So really quick, the framework objectives, or the objectives of the framework, are to articulate for policymakers, donors, government representatives, and self-care program implementers how SBC can support those SRH self-care initiatives and contribute to the improved SRH health outcomes, as I mentioned earlier. To illustrate the factors and groups that influence that individual self-care behavior and provide guidance and examples of how SBC can be applied to make those policy and programmatic decisions. And then also to generally increase awareness of how these various actors and influence an individual self-care journey and what SBC can do to influence those actors. Next slide. So how was the framework developed? This framework was developed through a rigorous 6-month human-centered design process and was informed by a desk review on self-care. Well, initially by intent setting, so meeting with a group of donors, policy makers, stakeholders in general, to get a better understanding of what existed in the self-care world, what challenges they were facing, and ideal future state outcomes. And then from there, we dove into a desk review on self-care and SBCs, and then identified these insights, gaps, and questions from the desk review to help guide our co-design workshop, which you see in the bottom left of the slide here. So based off of those findings, we conducted 2 virtual workshops with expert stakeholders again to discuss our findings and really try to build out the structure of this framework and what is needed and wanted by the self-care community. From there, we decided to design prototypes. So using the ideas and inspirations gathered from the desk review and then the workshops, to start drafting different variations of the framework itself, which then went into testing and different iterations where we got feedback, validated some of the aspects and the components of the framework, where we finally were able to finalize the framework, which is what is published now and available online. Next slide. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, the framework primary audiences include policymakers, donors, government representatives, and self-care program implementers responsible for decisions related to delivery or promotion of SRH self-care initiatives. And it helps, the framework helps these users to create an enabling environment for and the promotion of adoption of self-care behaviors. Next slide. So big picture, the framework components, it includes generally how and when an individual goes through the stages of change. You'll see that in the first image there, and we'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail, but the stages of change of when performing a behavior. And then also the framework covers the who and the what, who is influencing those behaviors in those different stages, as well as the where. So within this socio-ecological model, that outlines the multiple levels that these people and factors have the influential power over these individual behaviors. And we go on to the next slide. So as I've just mentioned, these stages of the self-care journey is covered in this framework. But in general, the framework is itself informed by various behavior change models and theories, but largely we do focus on the stages of change model of the individual self-care journey, combined with a socio-ecological lens to help understand the various actors and influences of the individual's behavior throughout their life. But these stages for the self-care journey include or start with awareness, so knowing and understanding self-care resources, methods, practice, then moving to decision, the choice to practice self-care, and then initiation, where they begin to practice the self-care method, continuation, where they're maintaining that practice, and then championing, so where individuals are encouraging others to practice self-care based off of their positive experience. And it's important to note that a person can move forward or backwards or even exit this self-care journey. It is a cycle depending on their circumstances. And also within these stages, there are multiple barriers and facilitators at each stage, and those are going to differ depending on the individual themselves. Next slide. And this is just a quick snapshot that you'll see within the framework, those 5 stages, as well as some more details about what is considered or what is each stage stands for. Next slide. So that second component of the framework, the socio-ecological model, that is a model of how behaviors are impacted at multiple levels of the environment of society that an individual is involved in. And these 5 levels that we use in this model consist of the individual themselves, that household level, the community, the health system level, as well as the policy and the enabling environment. So within at each of these levels, various factors and people can enable or hinder that individual's behavior among that stages of behavioral change. And so it's important to note that all these different influencing factors are going to be active throughout that individual's lifespan as they go through this behavior and try to continue it, or if they discontinue. There's so many different factors to take into consideration. You'll see on the next slide, this is just the representation of the socio-ecological model, as well as some of those influencing actors that are within the model. So as previously stated, there are many actors that are influencing an individual's journey to adopt and maintain self-care. However, the expert stakeholders that we talked to during our co-design sessions and our prototyping phases, they really identified 4 key actors that played a central role in self-care. And those include partners at the household level, friends and social influencers at the community level, and then at the systems or the health system level, you have the providers, and at the national level, policymakers. So a couple of examples of how these different influencers or actors take a role in the self-care journey. Think about partners. So partners play a big role in sharing information, discussing the self-care behavior or products that exist, and also supporting their partners with financial, emotional, and other needs to enable the individual. And then moving up to the community level, these friends and social influencers, they play a strong role in creating a supportive social norms around a behavior, demonstrating that behavior or product use, and sharing information about how to access that product or to get follow-up support. And thinking larger at the health system with the providers, as Heather mentioned earlier, play a very important role in counseling to ensure voluntary informed choice, giving correct information, demonstrating and explaining the self-care behavior or the product to be used, as well as increasing the individual's self-efficacy, providing training as needed, and also giving follow-up support for that continuation. And then at that larger national level, policymakers, they can set the enabling environment by endorsing self-care behaviors and approving self-care products and ensuring laws that enable self-care practice. All right, next slide. So another key component of this framework is the key determinants of self-care. So as we've discussed, and it's so obvious to many of us that there's so many factors that influence an individual's self-care behavior. So we talked about these key actors, we talked about behavioral determinants, and then there's also social determinants of health. So these determinants can positively or negatively influence a person's experience as they move along that self-care journey that we discussed. And at each stage, their influence may vary depending on the behavior or the country context. And so, like I said, the big part of this framework is also how it's grounded in the social determinants of health. And it emphasizes the need to explore how those determinants influence self-care adoption and maintenance. So we have identified 5 main social determinants of health, and these are according to the CDC, that we like to keep in mind as we go through this whole framework. And those include healthcare access and quality, education access and quality, and social and community contexts, economic stability, and the neighborhood and built environment. So each of these determinants shape the context in which individuals live and plays a role in the individual's self-care decision-making process, and they need to be considered and incorporated into the self-care interventions that are designed. So there are many actors, as I mentioned in the last slide, these key actors that take influence in individuals' journey to adopt and maintain self-care. So in combination with the social determinants of health, these behavioral determinants and key actors, there's a lot to take into consideration when designing an SBC program. Next slide. So with all that information about these factors that influence an individual picking a self-care behavior and practicing it, how do we use this framework? So I'm going to run through the following steps and provide a couple different examples. So step 1, you want to identify the self-care behavior or product that should be increased through these social SBC interventions, and also clarify what is the desired health outcome. And this includes determining if that self-care behavior or product is suited to improve that health outcome. So some of these different self-care behaviors that we can think about are exercise, self-exam, self-sampling, nutritional practices, or self-testing. So each user of the framework, whoever is using the framework, can focus on all of the steps I'm about to present, including step number 1, I think is one of the more important ones, but they need to consider which steps are most appropriate for them in their context. And next slide. So if needed, step 2 requires the user to review the framework and the guidance graphics that are provided with it from the perspective of the individual who's going to practice that self-care behavior or product. And then they'll need to conduct research or gather information around the individual's knowledge of the product or behavior, their motivations to use it, perhaps their barriers, and whether they have the agency to actually practice that behavior or use the products. So within the framework, you'll see around the individual, these key factors, including health literacy, motivation, agency. It's really important to understand the individual and how these 3 different components affect that individual's choice and ability to practice a self-care behavior. Next slide. So in step 3, that's when we move into the self-care behavioral journey. So the user of the framework will then consider the conditions needed for the individuals to move from one stage to the next. So again, starting at stage 1, awareness, and hopefully perhaps getting all the way to stage 5. But let's talk through those steps very quickly. Awareness. Are they aware of the behavior? Do they have access to the information through mobile phones, digital apps, from peers, community health workers, maybe other providers? This is the kind of information that the user of the framework needs to gather. Stage 2, decision. Do they perceive the self-care behavior or product to be relevant, to be beneficial? Are they motivated to practice the behavior? Or is there a provider or peer to show them how to use the product? Are they able to make that decision to use it? And then stage 3, do they know for initiation, do they know where they can get the product or how much it costs? Is there a supportive provider or peer to show them how to use the product? And in stage 4, continuation. They'll need to gather if the individual thinks it's easy to use. Is there social and partner support for the continuing of the behavior or product? Or is it easy to access follow-up support or get the product for that continuation? And then that last stage, it's important to understand if the user feels confident and perceives a social support for championing the behavior. Do they feel supported in sharing this information with others? Do they have opportunities to share this information and their experience with others? So at each stage, it's important for the user of the framework to ask, what are the main barriers to the use? Is it information, stigma, availability, cost, and to make sure to include solutions in the self-care intervention that they're designing. And this is all in order to enable the individual to adopt and continue the behavior. Next slide. So step 4, this is when we start to look at the different influencers at each stage of the journey. So we mentioned, partners, community members, etc. But these are meant to determine the facilitators or barriers that exist in the individual's life. So identify and consider what actors at each stage of the framework to determine which actors are the most important to focus on. So that includes conducting research or gathering information about the influencers and what encourages or hinders their effectiveness in supporting the individual to practice self-care. So a brief example, at the household level of the socio-ecological model, are their partners supporting the use of the product or the behavior? Are the mothers and the mother-in-law influential? If so, how? And what stigma or barriers exist around partner discussion around self-care or the behavior products? So that's important to do at every single stage: household, community, health system, and the national level. Identify those influencers at each stage of the individual's journey and see how they are enabling or hampering the practice of that self-care. Next slide. So the final step would be to then determine the goals and the interventions to increase the self-care behavior or product use. Determine the stages of change that are critical to achieve the targeted health outcomes, and identify those most important influencers at each stage of the behavioral journey. And of course, identify resources and funding for the intervention. So for maximum impact on health, multiple stages and levels in this framework should be included in the program to influence and enable the individual self-care behavior. And additionally, many stakeholders from across sectors may need to be involved in the process as well to accomplish the objectives and implement different aspects from the program. So this whole process is very collaborative, and it involves so many different stakeholders from different levels. Next slide. So very briefly, like I said, the audience of this framework are program implementers, government reps, donors, and policymakers. So they need to consider their roles in enabling an individual at each stage of the self-care journey. So reviewing the information in this framework can serve as a starting point to determine where and how they might facilitate self-care practice. And this slide just shows a few potential ways the framework, each framework user group can address influencing factors around self-care practice and how SBC can incorporate into their program planning. So as a quick example, under program implementers, it'll be really important for them to ensure that their program addresses the social and behavior barriers to self-care uptake as identified through the framework, including health literacy, motivation, and agency. But then over on the government rep side, they need to take into consideration and ensure that there's approval and registration and availability of self-care products. So the framework does a good job of outlining how each of these users can really utilize the framework to its fullest. And I believe that is the last slide. We can open up the floor to any questions you may have about the framework and check the chat real quick.
Thanks so much, Allison, for that great presentation. We have one question, and I think it's a little bit broader than just the framework itself. So I'm going to open it up to any of the facilitators on our call today. Kim said, it's so interesting to me that SBC really underpins sustained self-care practice, and yet it continues to be the missing ingredient or overshadowed. Why do you think this is? And are there countries that have really championed SBC for self-care where we can draw lessons like Nigeria or others? So anybody, any of the facilitators want to provide some thoughts about that particular question?
I can kick us off.
Great, thanks.
Hi, I can kick us off. I think just thinking broadly, SBC is typically less funded or underfunded when compared to kind of service delivery or interventions to expand commodities or access. And so, I think there can be funding issues that lend to that, and the balance of funding going towards SBC or behavioral interventions versus sort of access type interventions. I think that's one reason that I think we see in the broader investments in SBC versus service delivery or commodities, that we see that trend elsewhere.
Thanks, Andrea. Anybody else want to add?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Martha.
Oh, hi. Yeah, just quickly, I'll add on to Andrea's point there. I think the SBCC world in many places, is not well funded and has been I've worked for many years at the Pop Council. I've been around this for a while. It's been not a struggle, but it's taken a while for people to get their heads around that, regardless of self-care, right? Just in general, right? And so now it's adding something to self-care, which is a new domain. It's not straightforward. And I think, quite honestly, this is my bias, but I've been around a long time. People tend to get their heads around a thing, like a product, like a technology, like DMPA-SC self-injection. It's a thing, it's a noun, if you like. And this is a concept and a construct, and it's much harder to do. So that's my,
Yeah, thanks.
That's my two cents.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I think one thing that we've found in doing some work in SBC is that people tend to have a certain construct associated with SBC, and sometimes it's very narrow, like, oh, it's just demand generation for something. And I think that also makes it difficult because SBC, kind of as Allison was showing in the framework, could be applied to lots of different things beyond just getting people excited about a product. But I think too, some of the challenges that people mentioned earlier in the poll were around people don't really even know what self-care is. And I think that, SBC could be used in some of those instances to help people better understand what self-care even is. And we see that, self-care itself is inherently behavioral, like they are behaviors that people have to practice. So it's kind of funny that SBC has been overlooked because there is a need for actually engaging in behaviors in order for people to practice self-care. But there is kind of a disconnect, like you were saying, Martha, about, just people wanting to wrap their heads around a thing and something that they can grab hold of. Allison or Abby, do you want to add anything else before we move on?
I was just going to say kind of the part two of Kimberly's question about learning from other countries who are really championing for SBC and self-care. I think that would be great to hear their stories, as well as, if they're able to join or not already members of the self-care trailblazer group. That's a great place to discuss these initiatives and really share those success stories with each other.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good segue into, unless there are any more questions in the chat. you
I
want to
do see
cover?
one question in the chat, but perhaps for time's sake, we can answer that one in the chat. But I will read it out so that we can all have a think on it. And please, anybody here is welcome to respond to questions because these are kind of conceptual questions. So Elizabeth Gold said, are there concerns that some self-care diagnostics, if not used absolutely correctly, can cause more worry or harm than good? And how do we address those concerns? So I think, please, everybody feel free to add your thoughts there as well. But I will pass it over to Abby Winskill, who will give us a case study on some of what we've been talking about and hopefully ground some of these more conceptual thoughts. So over to you, Abby.
Great, thank you. And I think that question was a really good segue into this because we hope that this is a good example where we can get a lot of learnings, firstly around the importance of SBC for self-care innovation, but also you know, an example that has a lot of learnings, a lot of ideas about how to apply this to other methods. So I think many of you are aware of DMPA-SC and self-injection. Self-injection, so this is a contraceptive product that you can inject yourself, and it has many benefits. It puts more power in women's hands. Oh, is somebody, I don't know if someone's controlling this, but it seems to be jumping ahead, so apologies for that. It puts more power in women's hands. It's convenient. It saves money, so people don't have to go back if they're on using injectables. They don't have to go back to the facility every time, and it is seen to be less painful than the IM product. It also has huge potential to relieve burden on providers, especially public sector facilities, if they can train women to inject at home, potentially with the support of community health workers. And it also gives us a huge opportunity to contribute towards FP 2030 goals, either through bringing in new users into contraceptive use or through lower discontinuation. The challenge, however, has been that despite these benefits, over the last 5 to 10 years, self-injection really has been quite slow. The uptake of DMPA-SC as a product has been fast, has been relatively fast, but in terms of how the proportion of that is actually used for self-injection as opposed to providers substituting it for the regular IM product, we've seen a pretty low uptake. And so I'm just going to put a poll here just to test your knowledge. So again, if you can go to your Mentimeter, it's the same code as before, and I'm just going to move across. So our question here, just a little quiz, is okay, this is question 1 of 2 of our little quiz. Oh, why is this? Okay. So in 2020, what was the proportion of DMPA-SC that was self-injected in most countries, most LMIC countries? Was it less than 50%, less than 25%, less than 15%, or less than 5%? So what proportion of DMPA-SC was self-injected? The remainder, therefore, being used by providers in the same way as before. Okay, less than 15%. That is correct. So most people said, you know, less than 15%, and that is the case. And so what's really a shame about that is that we're seeing that, you know, this product, this self-care innovation is not being used in the way that it was, and its full potential isn't being realized. And the reason for that, as when DISC started, Project DISC, delivering innovation in self-care, which is a CIF and Gates funded project in Nigeria, Uganda, and Malawi, we really dug into really understanding where the barriers were across the user journey. And you'll see a lot of similarities as to how Alison was talking about the SBC framework, thinking about this stages approach. And we saw that women really didn't have any information about self-injection. They weren't being told about it unless the provider decided it was appropriate for them and a provider was acting as a gatekeeper. When it came to the decision point, there was a lot of fear of the needle and lack of self-efficacy because it was really felt that providers were the ones who should be administering injections. And then a lack of provider empathy and support at both the initiation and continuation levels. So DISC really has a focus on behavior change. That is what we advocate for. It's what we really focus on. We really focus on uncovering those insights, both from a consumer perspective and a provider perspective, to figure out how do we therefore design solutions that overcome those barriers. We very much have a design and test mindset. We test things with users, we gather insights as to what's working, and then we scale. It's an adaptive implementation approach. So we use both qualitative insights and then quantitative data for continuous optimization of those interventions, and then delivering through others. And so we've designed these self-care interventions, but then we're really focused on delivering them through others. So DISC, Delivering Innovation in Self-Care, is focused on bending the curve for self-injection by ensuring that all women who choose this method have frictionless access. And we really have 2 behavior change interventions. And I'm going to talk through each one and demonstrate how it links back to that SBC framework. The first one is an ecosystem that supports women through their journey. So this is a communications platform that helps women to take up, sustain use of, and advocate for self-injection. I'm really aiming to overcome those barriers throughout that user journey. And then secondly, we have a provider empathy training. And this is really focused on shifting the role of the provider from being the administrator of an injection to actually supporting women and overcoming their fears and creating their confidence to inject themselves. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is our behavior change ecosystem. And we call it an ecosystem because it's very much about using multi-channels, multi-tactics to deliver, to reach women and support them through that journey. And so if we connect it to the SBC framework, there are 3 main areas where this focuses. One is about empowering women to access and practice self-care. The second one is around supporting positive social norms, and a lot of that is about normalizing the behavior. I think SBC is critical in any for any contraceptive uptake or technology, but self-care in particular, when we think about self-care across all spaces, is it really is a completely new behavior for providers and women, and so or men, and so it really does need that emphasis, including male support. And secondly, we then have the final part is demonstrating confidence in women's ability to self-inject. So these are the areas where it really focuses in. So our communications campaign is really focused on the idea of discover your power, which is a rallying cry delivered through a multi-channel system. So this is a platform. We deliver it through multi-channels, and it's about going directly to women with information about self-injection, providing them with information at their fingertips, inspiration from trusted advocates, and then ultimately creating that linkage to uptake and training. And before I give you a snazzy video of our communications approach, I want to talk about the 4 principles which we've really focused on in terms of building this behavior. The first one is about going to the user or the woman with information about SI and avoiding the provider being the sole gatekeeper, and really making sure that the women are empowered to take up the product or to choose whether it's the right product for them. The second thing from a behavior change standpoint is to proactively overcome those barriers around lack of agency. So our radio scripts, our communications really actively address that concern and try to overcome those fears. We're also about creating relevance of self-injection and broadly contraceptive and having a halo effect across contraceptive. And then finally, we really tap into that peer advocacy. We see a lot of opportunity and power in the word of mouth, but also in seeing other women like me choosing self-injection and injecting themselves. So these are a lot of our principles that we are using. So I'm going to try this video. Please shout if you can't hear it, but I'm going to show you a glimpse into how we've approached our campaign.
because I don't like how condoms feels. I like it.
Look at you, Russia. But aside from pills and condoms, there's also the self-inject that you can use.
Self-inject what?
Yay to 3 months protection from unplanned pregnancy.
The self-inject contraceptive is 3 months safe, it is effective, and it provides reversible protection against unintended pregnancies.
Empisa yennyambye nnyo era entaasizza nnyo kubanga omwana wange asooka yasoma nga nze omukyala nga ndi naye.
Quietly while I sit next to you. I just need. Okay, thank you everybody, and apologize if you heard me talking to my daughter then. She is sick today, so apologies for that, but hopefully that gave you a glimpse into how we sort of brought this together and really inspired and reached women with key messages. So I then want to go on to the provider behavior change. And this is really then, obviously we can't, as much as self-care is about the user, we cannot ignore the critical role of the provider. And so as we go back to the SBC framework, we see again 3 areas from the provider behavior change focus. One is trusting clients' ability to self-inject, really creating that trust, and addressing biases, really being able and willing to patiently address clients' concerns and take the time to think about a different way for how they coach women. And then lastly, encouraging experiential learning. So again, another Mentimeter quiz. So one of the insights that we and others learned in terms of when women actually come to self-inject. So they've been through the training of self-injection with a provider. And what we saw was that before DISC, there was a large proportion of women who were choosing not to self-inject even after they had been trained. And the main reason was fear of the needle. So a quick poll, and let's see how many of us can get this one right, is question 2. What proportion of women who decided not to self-inject after training stated fear of the needle as the primary reason? Was it 80%, 60%, 40%, or 25%? I think you have 6 seconds left. Cast your votes now. Wow, across the board. Interesting. Okay, well, it was actually 80%. So 4 out of 5, and this was Path Access Collaborative's data backed up by DISC's own qualitative insight, demonstrating that of the women who chose not to self-inject after training, 80%, 4 out of 5 women, it was because of fear of the needle. And so what we saw here was that there were a large number of people who were not taking up self-injection after training. And that creates huge system inefficiencies. It's a huge leaky bucket after all this investment in demand and training. It's also a reduced value proposition for the provider. If they go through training and it can be time intensive and then women don't inject themselves. And also, again, we're reducing the potential of that innovation for women. We heard a lot about providers' barriers, that they didn't feel like they were able to support women to overcome that fear to self-inject. There was a lot of bias around who they felt would be able to self-inject, and therefore lack of personal conviction that they would offer it to all women. and a lot of making a decision about who they felt like more that they felt more educated people or younger people would be more appropriate for it, but really didn't see how they could support more women to self-inject. So DISC created an empathy-based training program that added on to the clinical training. So the clinical aspects of training are critical for DMPA SC and SI, but they really focus on the clinical aspects of teaching. What we're adding now is an empathy-based module, which helps to increase providers' confidence and capacity to effectively coach women to overcome those fears. Really giving them messaging where they can respond to women's fears, helping them to practice this through both role play with their peers and a practicum. And we've been adding this empathy-based training onto all of the original clinical-based training for self-injection. And really, the way that we approach this is very much from recognized practice and behavior change, where we think about how do we motivate, how do we help providers understand the value to their business, to their practice, and address some of those provider biases. Then we give them the ability, those empathy training messages, the practice, the support that they need then to give them the ability to support women to self-inject. And then we provide that maintenance where we're making sure they have commodities so they don't have stockouts. We're making sure they have good client flow so that immediately after training, they can practice their skills. And we give them on-the-job coaching and mentoring to make sure that we can build the capacity across the facility. And that really then ultimately leads, we hope, to that behavior and that habit. So just to show, we've now scaled this across 3 countries, across thousands of providers, but we've also conducted an evaluation to demonstrate the impact of this empathy training. And what we're seeing is that we see an exponential increase in SI visits. So this was in Nigeria across the facilities where we looked at. We saw an exponential increase in SI visits across all immediately after training, which is the phase 3 and 4. We also saw a 3 times increase in the proportion of DMPA SC that is self-injected. And what's also great is that we see that sustained over time, that results sustained over time as well. And so all of this together to sum up the 2 behavior change interventions that we have, the behavior change intervention going directly to women plus the empathy-based training for providers, those things together are really moving the needle on the self-injection nationally in Uganda, Nigeria, and Malawi. And here you can see in Nigeria, before we started in 2021, around 14% were self-injecting, and now we see 37% of DMPA SC is self-injected, and similar numbers in Uganda as well. So we're really, these behavior change interventions really have been catalytic. So in summary, we feel very strongly that, health innovation and particularly self-care requires investment in demand generation and behavior change, especially self-care, which is a very new behavior for users and providers. And I do just want to point out that this dedicated investment can still be balanced with informed choice. And I'm happy to answer questions about that as well. But our rallying cry, as it sounds like others believe in this chat, is that we really need to unlock the full power of innovation. And one key component of that is really ensuring that we're focused on behavior change. I'm going to stop there. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Abby. And we hope your child feels better. So I see a hand up. It looks like Martha's hand is up. Would you like to ask your question, Martha?
Or do you want to continue on? I don't want to interrupt the flow. I had a couple of questions and thoughts in here, but would be quiet if you guys have other things on your plate here.
No, this is the time. So we're gonna, I'm gonna facilitate through questions, as many as we have, and then we have some discussion that will facilitate if there's time. So please go ahead with your first question.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for an excellent presentation, Abby. And we see you're balancing the motherhood work role there. So thank you for that. Very helpful. A couple things that strike me about the presentation, and they're both comments and questions just to stimulate thinking here, I think. 2 points. I was the director of sexual reproductive health at PATH for many years, so I'm quite familiar with the DMPA access work, and maybe some of my PATH colleagues are on. But a couple things about this fear of women fearing the needle business. I think we should dig into that a little bit more, because in fact, many women said they were afraid of doing it wrong, which is a different challenge or problem. The actual fear of a needle, which in fact is a smaller needle than in depot, regular depot, because it's subcutaneous, not intramuscular. So unpacking that, because I think this notion of not getting it right. I mean, I think this is a woman's problem, always feeling like, oh, I'm not quite doing it right, or there's something wrong with what I'm doing. So I think that's something to explore a little bit further on that. The other thing I would just say is, and I put it in the chat, is we have this notion that, okay, the uptake of self-injection is low. Like, I don't actually buy that. I think 15% of women doing this practice is not insignificant. And it does speak to, like, what are we thinking is the right amount? There's a lot of behavioral journey questions that she addressed, but there's actually a lot of supply side issues, a lot, that influence this. I mean, women are not assured that if they do self-injection and they get another set to do it again the next 3 months, like that, the supply thing is not clear. And so many are coming back to the clinic again. And then sometimes in the clinic, they're just giving them regular IM because there's no self-injections, there's no subcutaneous left. So there's a whole host of those. I guess I'm arguing for, like, we have to be cognizant of both of those and not have some notion of what we think is the correct, the level, the speed of the uptake of this practice. Any new practice, any new technology takes a while for that to happen. So I'm not bothered by whatever 15%. I don't think that's bad at all, actually. So anyway, I have more thoughts on this, but I just think it's important to kind of stimulate kind of conversation around this.
Yeah, thanks, Martha. I really appreciate that. And honestly, we could talk for hours just about this. So we might have to have a follow-up discussion. It's something we've been working on for 4 years now. So a couple of points. So yes, and obviously today's session is on the behavior change side, but DISC also, we were always intended to focus on demand generation, but the reality is that we've also had to do a lot more on supply than we expected to do. And not just supply at the country level, but making sure that supply gets all the way down to the facility level. And we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we're connecting demand and supply together at a clinic level so that we can make sure that, as you say, all of those pieces connect. I would say on the first piece around the fear of the needle, I agree. I think it was multifaceted. It's fear of the pain. It's also that lack of agency and can I do it properly? And all of those things are things that we address within the empathy training and also in our communications as well. So we're trying to tackle it twofold. One, from the provider providing that comfort, but also going to women, having peers say, yes, we can do this, women can do this. And one thing I would say, which is I love this, is that when you go and you see a woman inject herself, she smiles and there's this immediate sense of power that she can do this herself. And I love seeing that every time I go out to clinics. And I think the final point I would say is, yes, I don't think we expect that 100% of DMPASC is ever going to be self-injected, and that's not necessarily the goal. I think the 15% when you compare to other methods though, and the access was low. And I think what we're aiming to do on DISC is much more about make it accessible and as much as possible as accessible as other methods. There will be a natural ceiling. We're not going to try to get to 100% of DMPASC as self-injected, but it was clear that there were some really key barriers that were preventing that access point across both demand and supply.
Heather, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Abby was saying too, that to your point, Martha, there was a lot on kind of the user journey, but I think the SBC self-care framework really does outline the need to look at some of those national or policy level issues and access, so SBC may be used to do more of the advocacy or helping to kind of see the situation and what's happening. So it's not just only focused on the client themselves and their particular journey, but it is focused on what are the conditions that will make it possible for an individual to adopt those new behaviors or to use a particular product. So it may be some of the advocacy or other work that would, enable the accessibility or availability or policies or those sorts of things that would make it possible for people to actually adopt those behaviors.
Did any participants want to chime in and provide some response to this as well? Okay, you're welcome to put any questions in the chat, should you have them. Reshma, I wanted to acknowledge your comment in the chat and thank you for your precision and for sharing this feedback about not necessarily discussing as a women's issue, but being ensure we're inclusive of all genders. Thank you. I wanted to touch back on Elizabeth Gold's question from a bit earlier. Are there concerns that some self-care diagnostics, if not used absolutely correctly, can cause more worry or harm than good? And how do we address those concerns? Elizabeth, I wanted to welcome you to come off of mute if you wanted to share a bit more about your question or respond to Heather's notes. And I welcome others if they want to share some response to Elizabeth's question. You're welcome to jump in as well.
No, I was just wondering if this has come up as an issue and how people have dealt with it in the past. Because I would imagine it could be a concern.
You know, from my experience, I've seen this especially at the policy level before introduction of new products and commodities. I think the idea of diagnostics causing more worry or harm than good, I think that really lends to the need to combine and really integrate and ensure strong like social and behavior change and self-care integration, social and behavior change and service delivery integration, so that some of the issues with linkage in self-testing, for example, so in self-diagnosis, ensuring that there are appropriate linkages back into the system or for support or otherwise that might be really important in those types of programs. But I welcome others. Martha, I see your hand. Did you want to respond back to this?
Yeah, on that particular point. Yeah. I think couple things. One is just the language we use. I mean, if we're talking about diagnostics, like DMPA-SC, its self-injection is not a diagnostic tool, but diagnostics are like HIV self-testing is a diagnostic tool. So when it comes to actual diagnostic tools, like HIV self-testing, if you don't do it correctly, you get a false positive or false negative. But any diagnostics, so that would be HIV self-testing, HPV self-sampling, you would have to go and get a confirmatory test anyway. Now, the question I think what was behind this was like, if you did the DMPA-SC self-injection wrong, or is there a concern about that? And I think providers do have a concern that, and this is true, there's always concern that women won't be able to do things right. I mean, there is that concern that many providers have, whether it be, around abortion or whatever, right? So I think that lends itself to more discovery around providers' attitudes, quite honestly. And is there an actual danger to doing something wrong? If in fact you did the self-injection of DMPA-SC wrong, what would happen? I guess if that's the question. It depends on, I mean, the most likely thing, nothing bad is done. The most likely thing is that you don't get enough of the dose of the drug and actually it's not effective. I mean, that's the worst case scenario, which is not a good case. But and one other point, just because I am a kind of in the biomedical side as well, I did want to make it clear to people that one of the things people like about DMPA-SC, remember SC stands for subcutaneous, right, is that it's less painful. That's not because it's a self-care thing. It's because the dose of the drug is less, and then it goes in subcutaneous, which means under the skin, as opposed to IM, which is intramuscular. So any product that's intramuscular will be more painful, and you will have to do a larger gauge needle to do that. So I'm just into clarifying language and the way we talk about things. So I don't know if this was helpful or not, but thank you.
Thanks, Martha. I appreciate it. Fauzia, over to you.
Everyone, just chiming in from the desk side. I know Abby is wrangling a sick child right now. But just to acknowledge Elizabeth's comment, and Martha, thanks for also the clinical clarification there. So from the DISC standpoint, you're absolutely right. You know, fear of the needle came in as sort of one of those top barriers when we did our initial sort of design research, but also, you know, women just being afraid of doing it incorrectly. So part of that, what Abby spoke to, is that within our empathy training, it's something that we bring forward to providers. So they get the clinical training on DMPASC. What we do is add on to that and build their skill and their capacity to really engage with women and with their clients on what exactly is it that's preventing them from even considering this as a method for themselves. So, you know, whether it's that needle itself and talking through, you know, having a smaller needle that it only goes so far. And then what if it's doing it incorrectly, being able to sort of talk them through the process, and there are various acronyms that they use, and, you know, really reinforcing the steps and supporting them through that first self-injection so that they can do it themselves in the future. And, you know, so that's kind of what we're doing in our empathy training. And what we do is we provide that initial training, give them the messaging to be able to really engage with their clients. And that's feedback that we've received from providers, is that, gosh, we wish we had this for all methods, because we're able to take our engagement with our clients to a whole other level, right? It's not just a one-off, okay, what do you need? Let me give it to you. It's a let me connect with you and make sure that this is meeting your needs. So we do that within the training, and then we don't leave it there. We provide routine supportive supervision to really reinforce that messaging, so that it is provider behavior change. It's not a one-off training, and really encouraging them to continue this relationship with their client and support them through their journey, because it might be that they choose self-inject now, but it might not be the method of choice, you know, a year down the road. So, you know, it really does build that relationship. So just wanted to respond to that from the DISC perspective. Thanks, Andrea.
Thanks, Fauzia. That's really helpful context and background. And thanks for the great discussion. We, Chioma, I see the comment you've made about literacy level and ensuring that there's appropriate literacy and communication or tools that are used to ensure equity of promotion of new products or demand creation for new products, or addressing behaviors for populations that are lower or illiterate, lower literacy or illiterate. It's very important, and I think really ties to the audience segmentation, even audience journey and profiling, where it is that you'll need to tailor that type of a response based on your target population's literacy needs. Thanks for that comment and contribution. So what I'd like for us to do now is I'm going to facilitate a discussion for us. We have had, we've heard about the SBC self-care framework. We've heard a great case study from DISC, and the conversation has been great. So I think it's always useful, and I tend to like where we can open the mic up and have discussion with each other and learn from each other. We have some experienced panelists here and we'd like to hear from you. And I know we've all been going to international webinars for many years now. Usually this is the time where we'll go into breakout rooms, but we wanted to keep us in plenary, keep us together so that we can kind of chat and keep learning as a group. And I have some questions to guide us, but really I'd love to hear from your experience as we move through the questions. So if you, for this, we'll be going back into the Menti. So you can click back into menti.com and enter the code to get back into the poll. So our first question, earlier we asked a poll about whether you have taken a behavioral approach or used SBC for your self-care program. So I'd love for you to enter into the poll if you've used a behavioral approach or SBC for a self-care program, what was the key behavior you were addressing and who was your audience? And you can just write that as a open response question in the poll. So go ahead in there now. Thanks, Allison. That's right. If Menti isn't working for you, feel free to write in the chat. We're an equal opportunity group. I'm a very low technology user, so I would be putting in the chat if I wasn't facilitating. Can we go to the next slide so we can see what responses are coming in? I'd like to view the results. So let's look at the results. Hang on.
For some reason, this one doesn't seem to be, I feel like the slide isn't working, Andrea, for some reason. Apologies for that. You might have to put in the chat or come off mute and speak to it. It looks like the next ones are, because it says they're waiting for responses, but this one doesn't for some reason.
Okay, great. Just give me 1 second, folks.
It's coming up now, Andrea.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so one example is that clients opt to use DMPASC. Another example that I provided was an example from DISC that Abby had shared on is providers counsel DMPASC clients to overcome fear of needles. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So based on your self-care program and what you learned or what you've learned about using behavioral approaches for self-care, are there any learnings or recommendations that you would advice that you would share with others to ensure that their success in program design and their outcomes? What are some of the key learnings that as a community you would like for people to keep in mind based on something that you learned through your own program? And I'll give you a few minutes to get back into the poll and include your answers. If anybody would like to come off of mute, I'm happy to. Okay, so the first response, these will roll in as the responses come. So understand your audience specific drivers and barriers to change. Directly ask people what they want or need.
Yeah. This is Christine. I also wanted to just say that understanding the perspectives of your audience with regard to those benefits. What we perceive as benefits may not be the same as what they perceive. So for instance, the fact that it's subcutaneous or it's IM that is much more painful is an important distinction. But also, it could still be a barrier because it's a needle period, whether it's because it's also just not something that they're used to, right? Because if you're not in a health environment where you are seeing people self-inject, like for insulin or for maybe fertility, for instance, it becomes very novel, right? So it takes some time. So really understanding what do they see, what's their perspectives of the benefits and the barriers, and not making assumptions.
Yeah, that's perfect. And listening to the audience segment, bringing that together, pre-testing, ensuring that you've gotten the framing right based on the benefits. Those are really great points, Christine. Thank you. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, someone had mentioned build the health literacy of clients. I'd love to hear a little bit more from, if you would like to come off mute, about how, what that learning was and how you built in improving health literacy within a self-care behavior intervention.
Hi, yeah, that was me. So yeah, this is about just making sure that that the people who are seeking the services are actually knowledgeable and have access to accurate information about what it is they're actually getting and how to sort of deal with it and any side effects and all the range of information that you need before you go into this. So I'm thinking specifically from, I work for Avert, and we provide health information on a website aimed at young people in sub-Saharan Africa. It's mainly HIV and sexual health. And we're doing a lot of information around PrEP, for example, you know, to get the uptake of PrEP in all its various forms. You know, the young people, or everyone who needs it, needs to understand it, especially if you want to fight the stigma that is surrounding, you know, the taking of PrEP.
Excellent, thank you. That's really helpful and important about, you know, what is required not only for, you know, perhaps an initial behavior, a first-time behavior, a provider-supported behavior, but then behavioral maintenance over time, and understanding health literacy and how something works, and you know, building that through the treatments that folks are taking, or the preventive mechanisms that people are taking, is a really great opportunity, and also critical potentially for sustained behavior over time. I see that we have some French responses. Thank you to Michelle for translating in the chat. We have in the first one about safe, innovative self-care approach to reach universal healthcare. Set up reciprocal trust. And ensure that there's a safe and efficient self-care approach. Thank you for your contributions. If any French speaker would like to come off of the off of mute, you're welcome to come and speak in French, and those who are speaking English will receive translation. So you're welcome to come off mute and contribute. I really appreciate the contributions about thinking about how others are influencing the individual and what you can do to address those influencers, moving beyond only, you know, promotion of a product or creating demand, but actually working toward addressing some of the social and community factors or influencing factors that go beyond individual level. Let's move to the next poll, and we'll do our last question. Let's go to the next one, skip through this one again. And the final one. So thinking about our, you know, influencers and influencing audiences, thinking about the framework that Allison shared and some of the, you know, key tips that Heather brought in. Abby talked about the case study related to providers. What thoughts do you have about how might we address provider behaviors to support self-care? I think we started this conversation where we talked about some folks might want provider assisted care, or they might continue to opt for providers rather than self-injecting. There are other provider behaviors beyond just self-inject. There are other provider behaviors that are relevant to either influencing initiation or someone starting a treatment, a preventive method, or even like a regular diagnostic. What thoughts do folks have about that? And we can go to the next, we can show the results so that the results can come in as we go. Any contributions there? That's a really interesting and important takeaway. I think that there has been in some programs some tension with providers about their shifting role or how their role changes vis-a-vis clients, or even continued care when you introduce a product like self-inject. And so helping providers see the value of self-care and that it's not a threat to their livelihood. It's not necessarily taking away their livelihood or their role or their power. Reinforcing client choice and the provider as a source of information and support rather than a decision maker. That's incredible. And I think that really speaks to some of the ways that, empathy, providers developing empathy for clients, as well as working on programs that center empathy for providers in helping to reframe and support provider skills and approach to counseling that's much more client-centered, reinforces client choice rather than kind of facilitating those decisions. We are nearing the end of our session, so I wanted to hand it back over to Abby to close us out.
Great, thank you all. I feel like I wish we had another hour where we could all talk together, because I think it's been a really great session, and I think we're just scratching the surface on the expertise and experience that everyone in this room has. So I would just like to say a big thank you for your time today. Thank you for sticking with us and listening to us today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. And our advocacy, or our call to action, is that we all go out and talk in the community of practice, and talk with our donors, and talk with our partners, and talk with the ministries of health about the importance of behavior change as we look to really unlock the potential of self-care across all health interventions across all countries. Please continue to share any thoughts in the chat, and reach out to any of us if you want to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate your time today and hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, thanks.